the shocking, sudden and violent deaths of legendary film director Rob Reiner and his wife. A spokesperson for the Reiner family says the couple was found dead in their Los Angeles home.
At 78, Rob Reiner's story took a devastating turn that stunned the public. He and his wife, Michele, were found dead inside the same quiet home where they had built decades of peace and privacy. Their marriage was steady, private, and seemingly untouched by turmoil, which makes the loss even harder to grasp. Nothing about their public life hinted at what was coming. One moment defined by routine, the next by finality. What happened behind those closed doors raises questions that refuse easy answers and leaves a silence that feels deeply unsettling. The day everything stopped. The day began like any other, quiet and unremarkable from the outside. But by the afternoon, everything had changed. Authorities were called to a home in the Brentwood area of Los Angeles, a place long associated with privacy and normal routine. Inside, Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife, Michele Reiner, were found dead. The confirmation alone was enough to stun the public. For many, it was difficult to even process the words. A respected filmmaker and his longtime partner, gone without warning. Early reports offered very little detail. Law enforcement confirmed 2 deaths and stated that the situation was being treated as a homicide investigation. Beyond that, officials were careful and restrained. There were no immediate explanations, no public theories, and no rush to fill in gaps. That silence only deepened the shock. The absence of information created a heavy pause, one where disbelief lingered longer than clarity. News of the discovery spread quickly, but understanding did not. Rob Reiner was a familiar presence for decades, known not just for his work, but for his consistency. He and Michele had been married since 1989 and were rarely connected to scandal or public drama. Their home was seen as a place of stability, not danger. That contrast made the moment especially jarring. A setting tied to safety and routine had suddenly become the center of an unthinkable event. While the investigators were getting the necessary evidence at the scene, neighbors and people passing by were standing at a distance. Some of them immediately recognized the place. Others only realized the importance when the names were confirmed. The reaction was muted but heavy, characterized by confusion rather than a show. It was not a loud or chaotic scene. It was quiet, controlled, and deeply unsettling in its calmness. The officials announced that the investigation was active and still going on. They assured that the information would be given out only when it was the right time. This decision was a signal of the magnitude of the incident. When the authorities opt for silence, it very often implies the matter is intricate. For the public, that intricacy was nothing but unease. The absence of answers pointed to the fact that this was not a simple case. What made the day even more difficult to comprehend was that it seemed very mundane at first sight. There were no alerts to the public, no warnings of any danger during the days preceding it. To the outside world, Rob and Michele were merely going on with their lives as usual. That abrupt change from normalcy to tragedy left many in a dilemma of trying to match up the facts as they had known them with the reality of the situation. At the end of the day, one fact was already established. Just like that, what had happened in that house had not only affected negatively one family, but also the entire story of that family in the future. And the more hours passed, the more it became clear that this was the opening of a very painful and complicated chapter, only the beginning. And to understand how a life built so carefully could unravel so suddenly, let's go back to the parts of the story that stayed out of sight for years, the struggles, tensions, and choices that would eventually pull everything inward. A life built far from chaos. Long before tragedy entered the picture, Rob Reiner and Michele Reiner had built a life defined by intention and restraint. While Rob spent decades shaping some of the most recognizable films in American culture, his private world remained deliberately calm. Fame surrounded his career, but it rarely entered his home. That separation was not accidental. It was a choice made early and reinforced over time. Rob Reiner's work placed him at the center of Hollywood for generations. From television to film, his projects reached millions and became part of everyday life. Yet those who knew him often noted the contrast between his public influence and his personal simplicity. Away from sets and premieres, he valued routine, conversation, and time with family. Success never replaced stability in his priorities. Michele singer Reiner played a crucial role in preserving that balance. She was not drawn to constant visibility or attention. Friends described her as grounded, thoughtful, and deeply protective of her family's space. While she worked as a producer and supported Rob's career, her focus remained firmly on home life. She believed privacy was not something to be guarded out of fear, but something worth protecting for its own sake. Together, they raised their children with an emphasis on presence rather than image. The Reiner household was not shaped around status or expectation. It was shaped around consistency. Family dinners, shared routines, and emotional availability mattered more than appearances. Even as Rob's films continued to succeed, the structure of their home stayed largely unchanged. Their union was built on the same principles. When Rob and Michele got married in 1989, they did not allow public performance to dictate their relationship, as it often happens with celebrity couples. No scandals, no rows, and no turning their love into a story were the tenets of their marriage. Affection was expressed subtly and was very reliable. Eventually, that trait became the main one through which they were identified among their friends. The couple's later years were spent more and more with their lives revolving around themselves. There were fewer and fewer public appearances. They trusted only a small circle of friends. The pace of their life was dictated by the intimacy and understanding they shared. It was not a period of reinvention, but one of comfort and continuity. For them, aging was not a disruption of connection, but a deepening of it. That past was the reason why the suffering was so hard to understand. The couple's breakup remained entirely behind closed doors. There was no visible commotion, and the impression that their world was quite stable was not eradicated. From the outside, everything looked steady and contained. But even the most carefully protected lives can face moments when calm gives way to questions. And when those questions demand answers, attention inevitably turns to what happened behind closed doors. Inside the investigation. Once the shock of the discovery settled, the focus shifted to the meticulous work of investigators tasked with reconstructing the final hours inside the Reiner's Brentwood home. What initially appeared as a tragic and confusing scene quickly became an active homicide investigation. Law enforcement moved carefully, aware that the people involved were not only public figures, but a family whose private life had suddenly become the center of national attention.
Director Rob Reiner and his wife, Michele, were found dead in their Los Angeles home. Their son, Nick Reiner, is now in custody. They were found dead Sunday afternoon in their Brentwood, California home.
Police responded to the home after a family member discovered Rob Reiner and Michele singer Reiner deceased. Officers secured the scene and began a detailed examination of the property. Investigators documented the layout of the house, collected physical evidence, and worked to establish a clear timeline. The goal was not speed, but accuracy. Every movement, entry point, and detail mattered. Authorities confirmed early on that the couple had died from stab wounds, immediately ruling out natural causes. From there, detectives began narrowing their focus. They examined whether there were signs of forced entry, robbery, or an external threat. According to law enforcement sources, nothing suggested a break-in. That absence of outside intrusion became a critical factor in how the investigation unfolded. Investigators then turned to digital and behavioral evidence. Phone records, location data, and witness accounts were reviewed to understand who had been in contact with the Reiners and when. Surveillance footage from nearby areas was also examined. These steps helped establish movements before and after the estimated time of death, allowing detectives to piece together a clearer sequence of events. One thing that was highlighted and caught everyone's attention was the fact that Nick Reiner was not present at the house when the bodies were found. The investigators opined that he might have vacated the house shortly after the stabbings. This time frame became the focal point of the inquiry. The police made efforts to ascertain his destination, duration of absence, and what transpired in the interim. Eventually, this piece of information became significant in finding and apprehending him on the same day. The law enforcement agencies were cautious with their public pronouncements during the entire affair. The authorities pointed out that the release of excessive information too soon might indeed thwart the case. They applied for search warrants for the house, and forensic teams were still collecting evidence long after the first response team had left. Each move was recorded with the realization that the results would eventually be challenged in court. The investigation went even deeper than just looking at the house. Detectives were in contact with relatives, neighbors, and those who had seen Reiners just before their deaths and had spoken to them. A supposed quarrel at the holiday party the night before was considered part of that wider investigation, not as a definite conclusion, but as a context, and was examined that way. In the investigation, no assumptions were allowed. The validity of each piece of evidence had to be established independently. As the case moved on, it became clearer that this was not just about recognizing what happened, but also about making certain that any conclusions drawn were strong, accurate, and capable of withstanding the legal process that would ensue. As the evidence began to align and the picture sharpened, one truth became harder to avoid. The investigation was no longer focused on an unknown threat. What investigators uncovered would shift the story inward, forcing a confrontation with something far more personal and far more painful. When the struggle turned inward. As investigators continued piecing together what happened inside the Reiners' Brentwood home, the case took a devastating turn. Within hours of discovering Rob Reiner and Michele Singer Reiner dead, law enforcement attention shifted inward, toward their own son. Nick Reiner, 32, was taken into custody Sunday night and booked on suspicion of slaying. For the public, the arrest was almost impossible to absorb. The tragedy was no longer only about loss. It had become a story of a family breaking from within. Authorities stated that Nick Reiner was not at the home when his parents' bodies were discovered. Investigators believe he left sometime after the stabbings. Using information gathered early in the investigation, police located him near the University of Southern California later that evening. He was arrested without incident and is currently being held without bail.
What does it mean that Nick wasn't medically cleared for transport? Well, usually after an evaluation, the staff determines that this person is not stable enough to be moved, and it's because of one of three reasons: physical injury, illness, or a mental health evaluation. We were not told which one applies in this case.
Law enforcement officials later said they believe Nick is responsible for the deaths, though specific details have been withheld as the case proceeds through the legal system. For many observers, the arrest raised painful questions that extended beyond the crime itself. Nick Reiner's struggles had been known long before this moment. He had spoken openly for years about his battle with addiction, instability, and repeated attempts at recovery. His life was marked by cycles of rehabilitation, relapse, and periods of homelessness, challenges he never denied or minimized. Nick's first experience in a rehabilitation facility happened during his adolescent years. By way of interviews and podcasts, he shared the story of how he learned to maneuver through the treatment systems without actually changing. And then, of course, he would slip back into the same old patterns of destruction. He confessed to doing things that put a strain on the family and tried the patience of his nearest and dearest. These were not the discoveries that came to light after the disaster. They were a part of the public record that he had been the one to share. The Reiner family was not hiding away from these problems. In 2015, Rob Reiner was the director of Being Charlie, a movie whose storyline was co-created by Nick and was directly influenced by his addiction experiences and his struggles. At that very moment, the father and the son were talking openly about how hard the process was. Rob recognized that they had fights during the making of the film, but he said that it caused him to comprehend better what his son had gone through. The project was considered by many as a sign of support and a healing attempt. Just before the slayings, investigators exposed that there was tension again between the parties involved. The media reported that Nick had been arguing with his father during the holiday party the night before the slayings, according to law enforcement's reliable sources. Witnesses were surprised by the behavior of Nick and labeled it as eccentric. The attention was immediately drawn to the family squabbles, when, one day, an investigation revealed it. It's essential to distinguish between history and judgment. Addiction and family disputes may be the reasons for violence, but they do not justify the violence. However, investigators usually consider long-term patterns of stress, instability, and recent confrontations to understand the context. In this case, those patterns added another layer of heartbreak. The arrest made the public face a painful truth. A family that had been trying to support a troubled son for years could now only experience an outcome that love and efforts could not undo. With the arrest, the tragedy crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Private pain had become a public reality, and the weight of that revelation would soon ripple far beyond the family, reaching an industry, a city, and millions who struggled to make sense of what they were witnessing. Public shock and collective grief. The deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife, Michele Reiner, sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond, as tributes poured in from peers, collaborators, political leaders, and fans whose lives had been touched by their work. Across the entertainment industry, figures remembered not just a filmmaker and his partner, but two people whose influence went far beyond the screen. Actors and directors shared heartfelt reflections on social media and in interviews, underscoring how deeply the loss was felt.
Tragic deaths of actor-director Rob Reiner and his wife Michele continue to send shockwaves through Hollywood tonight and stun film lovers around the globe.
Jerry O'Connell described Reiner's passing as feeling like a parent has passed, emphasizing how formative Reiner's guidance had been during his own early career. Kevin Bacon paid tribute to the warmth and generosity Reiner brought to the set, calling the news heartbreaking, while Mandy Patinkin called the slayings an unthinkable tragedy that demanded reflection on their impact. Comedy and television also took part in the mourning. Jerry Seinfeld reminisced about how Reiner's backing kept Seinfeld going when others were skeptical about its potential, attributing to him a crucial part in the show's victory. Other performers and co-workers, among them Christopher Guest and Jamie Lee Curtis, along with Ben Stiller, Kathy Bates, and Carrie Elwes, conveyed their sorrow and their admiration, calling Reiner a very generous creative power whose influence not only dictated but also inspired the careers of many and a great number of others. Their influence reached the political sphere as well. The former President Barack Obama and the former First Lady Michelle Obama released a joint statement in which they lamented the couple's deaths, reflecting on Rob Reiner's narrative legacy and on his commitment to the values of justice and empathy that defined his life and art. Even outside the show business, the tributes did not only stress the professional achievements, but also the personal character. Friends talked about Michele's kindness and support, and about the couple's long marriage, which was based on respect and care for one another. As tributes continued and voices echoed with disbelief and sorrow, the world paused to remember who Rob and Michele Reiner were before tragedy defined the moment, and to consider what remains once the headlines fade and the mourning grows quieter. What remains after the headlines? As the days passed and the rush of breaking news slowed, the story of Rob Reiner and Michele singer Reiner shifted. What once dominated headlines grew quieter, moving from urgency to reflection. When speculation fades and cameras move on, a harder question remains: what is left behind? Headlines can explain what happened, but they rarely capture what endures. In this case, what remains is not just the memory of a crime, but the absence of two people whose lives were deeply connected to others. Family, friends, and collaborators are left carrying a loss that cannot be reduced to timelines or statements. Rob Reiner's work continues to live on. His films still play in homes and classrooms, offering laughter, warmth, and reflection. Over time, those stories may become a way to remember who he was rather than how his life ended. His creative voice remains familiar, steady, and intact. Michele singer Reiner's legacy is felt more quietly. Her influence lives in family routines, shared memories, and the sense of stability she worked to protect. For those closest to her, her absence shows up in small, everyday moments, a silence where care and presence once existed. For the Reiner family, grief does not end when the news cycle does. Healing, if it comes, happens privately and unevenly. Relationships shift, routines change, and life moves forward with an altered sense of normal. There is no timeline for understanding such a complicated loss. Beyond the family, the tragedy leaves a broader reminder. Public lives still contain private struggles, and love alone cannot always shield families from harm. These truths linger long after attention fades. In the end, what remains is quieter than the headlines: memory, influence, and the human lives behind the story. Rob and Michele Reiner are remembered not for the shock of their final chapter, but for the lives they lived and the connections they left behind. Rob Reiner and Michele's story is not defined by how it ended, but by the quiet life they chose to live together. Their love was steady, private, and real, something rare in any world. The tragedy only deepened the contrast between the life they built and the loss that followed, leaving behind reflection rather than answers. If this story made you think, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Like the video, subscribe for more deep stories like this, and watch the next video on screen to continue exploring the lives behind the headlines.